The waiter waved her away like a stray dog, his face twisted with disgust as he glanced nervously at the wealthy diners who didn't want to see poverty interrupting their expensive evening. But then came words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "I'll eat it from the floor if you let me. Welcome back and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might change how you see the world." The golden glow of Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, Le Bernardin, cast warm light across tables draped in pristine white linens, where crystal glasses caught the flicker of real candles and silverware gleamed like precious metals. The soft murmur of sophisticated conversation mixed with the gentle clinking of expensive china, creating the kind of ambient luxury that only money could buy. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city's skyline sparkled like a jewelry box, each light representing dreams and ambitions that felt both infinite and impossibly distant. Rebecca Monroe sat at table 12, her manicured fingers scrolling through emails on her phone, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd built a tech empire from nothing but determination and sleepless nights. At 38, she commanded boardrooms with the same ease that others ordered coffee, her tailored black dress and understated diamond earrings suggesting success without ostentation. Her company, Tech Forward Solutions, had just secured a deal that would revolutionize healthcare data management, and tonight's dinner was meant to be a celebration with potential investors who saw dollar signs in her innovative algorithms. The conversation around her table flowed like expensive wine, talk of market projections, acquisition strategies, and the kind of numerical abstractions that turned human needs into profitable opportunities. Rebecca nodded at appropriate moments, smiled when expected, but part of her attention remained fixed on the email chain discussing her latest project, an AI system designed to predict and prevent homelessness in major cities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was discussing poverty prevention while dining on $40 appetizers, but she'd learned that change often came from within the systems that perpetuated problems. "Ms. Monroe, your vision for predictive social services could transform municipal budgeting," said David Hartwell, a silver-haired venture capitalist whose enthusiasm for social impact seemed directly proportional to potential returns on investment. "We're looking at implementing this in 12 cities within the first year." Rebecca was about to respond when a commotion near the restaurant's entrance caught her attention. A small figure had somehow slipped past the hostess station, moving between tables with the desperate urgency of someone who understood that survival sometimes required breaking social rules. The child, for it was clearly a child, though one who moved with the wary calculation of someone much older, approached their section with trembling determination. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, but her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Her brown hair hung in tangled knots that suggested weeks without proper care, and her clothes, a coat so oversized it swallowed her small frame, pants that might have once been jeans but were now more patches than original fabric, told a story of neglect that made Rebecca's chest tighten with recognition and dread. "Excuse me," the child whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. She stood beside their table like a ghost, her small hands gripping the edge of the white tablecloth, with fingers that were chapped raw from cold and hunger. "I'm sorry to bother you, but..." The waiter appeared immediately, his face flushed with the kind of professional embarrassment that came from security breaches in establishments that prided themselves on exclusivity. "I'm so sorry," he said to the table, his tone suggesting the child was a spilled wine stain rather than a human being. "She must have slipped past the front desk. I'll have her removed immediately." "Please," the girl continued, ignoring the waiter's attempts to grasp her shoulder. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. If you're not going to finish that, I could eat it from the floor. I won't make a mess, I promise." The words hit the table like a physical blow, silencing conversations and freezing forks halfway to mouths. Rebecca felt something crack open in her chest, not her heart, which implied something clean and quick, but something deeper and more fundamental, like the sound of a foundation settling under too much weight. "What did you say?" Rebecca asked, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over their section of the restaurant. The child looked up at her with eyes that seemed too old for her face, brown irises flecked with gold that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now just looked hollow with hunger. "I said I could eat it from the floor, ma'am. I don't want to be any trouble. I haven't had anything since Tuesday and today's Thursday, and I thought maybe—" "Get her out of here," hissed David Hartwell under his breath, his earlier enthusiasm for social impact apparently not extending to actual encounters with the problems he was eager to solve through profitable algorithms. "This is completely inappropriate." But Rebecca held up her hand, her attention completely focused on the child whose desperation had cut through the evening's manufactured sophistication like a knife through silk. "What's your name?" "Emily," the girl whispered, her voice trembling with the effort of maintaining dignity while begging for scraps. "Emily Carter." Rebecca's world tilted sideways, the restaurant's warm lighting suddenly feeling too bright, the ambient noise too loud, the very air too thick to breathe. Emily Carter. The name hit her like a physical blow, carrying with it memories that she'd tried to bury beneath years of successful business deals and philanthropic donations that had felt meaningful until this moment. "Carter," she repeated, her voice barely functioning. "Your mother, was her name Allison?" Emily's face transformed, hope flickering across her features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "You knew my mama, Allison Carter." Rebecca's college roommate at Northwestern University, her soul sister, the woman who'd held her hair while she cried through heartbreaks and celebrated with her when she'd landed her first job in tech. Allison, who'd called her 3 years ago from a hospital bed, her voice weak but urgent. "Rebecca, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll take care of Emily. She's all I have, and you're the only person I trust." Rebecca had promised, of course. How could she not? But when Allison died just days later from complications after what should have been routine surgery, Emily had vanished into the foster care system before Rebecca could navigate the legal complexities of fulfilling that promise. Social services had been uncooperative, claiming privacy laws prevented them from sharing information about Emily's placement. Rebecca's lawyers had hit bureaucratic walls at every turn, and now here she was, Allison's daughter, the child Rebecca had sworn to protect, standing beside a table in Chicago's most expensive restaurant, begging to eat scraps from the floor. "I tried to find you," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking as years of guilt crashed over her like a tsunami. "I swear to God, Emily, I tried everything." Emily's hollow eyes studied Rebecca's face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that adults' promises were as fragile as spun glass. "I waited," she said simply. "For a long time I waited." The weight of those words settled over Rebecca like a burial shroud. While she'd been building her empire, attending board meetings and sleeping in silk sheets, Allison's daughter had been waiting for a rescue that never came. The business dinner around her continued in awkward whispers, but Rebecca no longer existed in that world of profit margins and investment strategies. She existed only in this moment, facing the living proof of her greatest failure. "Please," Rebecca said to the waiter, who still hovered nearby like a vulture waiting to clean up an embarrassing mess. "Bring her whatever she wants. Everything on the menu if she wants it." Emily shook her head quickly, fear flashing across her features. "I don't need much, just maybe some bread? I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Rebecca said firmly, then stood and guided Emily to the empty chair beside her, ignoring the uncomfortable glances from her business associates. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." As Emily tentatively picked at the breadbasket, with hands that shook from hunger, Rebecca's mind raced back to those frantic weeks after Allison's funeral. She remembered calling the Department of Children and Family Services dozens of times, only to be told that information about Emily's placement was confidential. She'd hired private investigators who'd hit dead ends at every turn. The system had swallowed Emily whole, and Rebecca's money and influence had been useless against bureaucratic walls designed to protect children, but sometimes imprisoned them instead. "Where have you been living?" Rebecca asked gently, watching Emily devour a dinner roll with the desperate efficiency of someone who couldn't be sure when her next meal would come. "Different places," Emily said between bites, her voice carefully neutral in the way children learned to speak when the truth was too dangerous to share. "After Mama died, they said I had to go live with my father." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. Allison had spent years hiding from Emily's father, a man whose name she'd only spoken in whispers and whose presence had sent her into panic attacks that lasted for hours. "Your father found you?" "The state found him," Emily corrected, her small fingers methodically shredding the remains of her bread. "They said every child deserves to be with their real family, even if their mama said they shouldn't be." The casual way Emily delivered this information made it even more devastating. She spoke about systemic failure, the way other children might discuss the weather. with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd learned that adults' good intentions often paved the road to hell. Rebecca remembered Allison's late-night confessions during their college years, whispered admissions about the boyfriend who'd become possessive, then controlling, then violent. "He used to lock me in closets," Allison had said one night, after too much wine and too many triggered memories. "He said I was worthless, that no one would ever love me. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to run." And run she had, changing her name, moving across the country, working minimum-wage jobs to stay invisible while she put herself through nursing school one semester at a time. She'd built a new life through sheer determination, creating safety for herself and Emily through careful anonymity and constant vigilance. "He wasn't kind to you, was he?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Emily flinched when the waiter moved too quickly nearby. "He said Mama poisoned me against him," Emily replied, her voice growing smaller. "He said I needed to learn respect, but after a while he got tired of teaching me, so he sold me." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant evening routine, wine being poured, desserts being served, conversations flowing about vacation plans and stock portfolios. But Emily had just described being sold like property, and her matter-of-fact delivery suggested this wasn't even the worst thing that had happened to her. "Sold you?" Rebecca's voice came out as a croak. "To the Hendersons," Emily said, finally looking up from her bread. "They have a house where lots of kids live. They said they were saving us, giving us homes when nobody else wanted us. But really we just worked." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists as Emily described her life at the Henderson house. 14-hour days scrubbing floors and washing clothes, sleeping in a laundry room with 6 other children, being fed once a day if they met their cleaning quotas. The Hendersons collected state money for each child they fostered, while running what amounted to a child labor camp, hidden behind the facade of charitable family services. "There were older kids too," Emily continued, her voice growing even quieter. "Sometimes men would come and pick them up for special jobs. The older kids said those jobs paid better, but the kids who went never came back to tell us about it." Rebecca felt sick. Emily was describing a trafficking operation that had been operating under the protection of the foster care system, collecting government funds while exploiting the most vulnerable children in society. And Emily, at 6 years old, had understood enough to be terrified of what awaited her when she got older. "How did you get away?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I ran," Emily said simply. "Mrs. Henderson was going to send me on a special job next week. She said I was getting old enough to be useful in new ways, so I broke the window in the laundry room and ran in the middle of the night." "How long ago was that?" "I think maybe 8 months? 9? It's hard to keep track." 8 months. This child had been surviving on Chicago streets for 8 months, through a winter that had broken records for cold temperatures and a spring that had been unseasonably harsh. Rebecca's mind reeled at the mathematics of survival. How does a 6-year-old find food, shelter, safety in a city that barely protected its adult, homeless population? "I slept in a cardboard box behind a dumpster most nights," Emily continued, as if reading Rebecca's thoughts. "Sometimes the people at the shelter would let me in if there was room, but usually there wasn't. Kids without parents aren't supposed to be in the adult shelters, but I learned to lie about my age." Rebecca watched this child, this baby who should have been worried about homework and playground friends, describe survival strategies with the clinical detachment of a war correspondent. Emily had learned to make herself invisible during daylight hours, to scavenge food from restaurant dumpsters before the garbage trucks came, to recognize the difference between police officers who might help and those who would just send her back into the system that had failed her so catastrophically. "The hardest part wasn't being hungry," Emily said, accepting a glass of milk from the waiter with careful politeness. "The hardest part was remembering what Mama's voice sounded like. Sometimes I'd wake up and I couldn't remember her face." That's when Rebecca began to cry, not the polite tears that might be appropriate for a business dinner, but the kind of soul-deep sobbing that comes from recognizing the magnitude of your own failure. She'd been living in luxury while Emily lived in cardboard boxes. She'd been making speeches about her AI systems that could predict homelessness, while Emily was experiencing it firsthand as a 6-year-old child. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, reaching across the table to take Emily's small hand. "I should have found you. I should have tried harder. I should have broken down every door until I got to you." Emily looked at their joined hands with something like wonder, as if human touch without violence was a foreign concept. "You're here now," she said simply. "Mama always said you would come if I really needed you." The business associates had long since made their excuses and left, unwilling to witness a level of emotional reality that didn't fit their carefully curated worldview. Rebecca didn't care. She'd lost millions in potential investment that night, but she'd found something infinitely more valuable, the child she'd failed to protect, who was somehow still alive, still fighting, still believing that love might exist somewhere in the world. "You're coming home with me tonight," Rebecca said, her voice steady now with absolute determination. "And you're never going to be hungry or cold or scared again. I promise." Emily studied her face with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned that promises were dangerous things to believe in. But slowly, tentatively, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "But if you change your mind, I'll understand. Adults change their minds a lot." Rebecca squeezed her hand gently. "I won't change my mind. Some promises are meant to be broken, but this isn't one of them." Rebecca's penthouse apartment on Lakeshore Drive had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, praised for its minimalist elegance and breathtaking views of Lake Michigan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic vista of the city's glittering skyline, while the interior design spoke of sophisticated taste and unlimited resources, marble countertops, Italian leather furniture, original artwork that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But as Emily stepped through the front door, clutching Rebecca's hand with desperate intensity, none of the luxury registered in her hollow eyes. Instead, she scanned the space with the calculating attention of someone who'd learned that survival depended on identifying escape routes and potential hiding places. Her gaze lingered on the locks, the windows, the distance between the front door and the elevator. "This is beautiful," Emily whispered, but her voice carried no wonder, only the careful politeness of someone who'd learned that expressing the wrong opinion could result in punishment. "This is home," Rebecca corrected gently, kneeling down to Emily's eye level. "Your home, for as long as you want it to be." Emily nodded, but Rebecca noticed how she positioned herself so that no walls blocked her path to the exit. Trust, Rebecca realized, would take much longer to build than a single evening of kindness could provide. The first night was a revelation in trauma's lasting effects. Rebecca had prepared the guest bedroom with new sheets, soft pillows, and a collection of children's books she'd ordered online during the car ride home. But when she showed Emily the bed, the child shook her head with quiet determination. "I can sleep on the floor," Emily said, eyeing the queen-sized mattress as if it were a trap. "I'm used to hard surfaces. Beds make me nervous." "Why do they make you nervous, sweetheart?" Emily's fingers twisted in the oversized coat she still refused to remove. "At the Henderson house, if they found you sleeping in a real bed, they said you were getting above yourself. They'd make you sleep outside for a week." Rebecca's heart shattered a little more. Even here, in complete safety, Emily's body carried the memory of punishments for accepting comfort. They compromised. Emily curled up on the thick area rug beside the bed, wrapped in the softest blanket Rebecca owned, while Rebecca sat in the nearby chair until Emily finally fell asleep. But sleep brought no peace. Emily's small body jerked with nightmares, her hands batting at invisible threats, while she whimpered words Rebecca couldn't understand. When Rebecca tried to wake her gently, Emily's eyes snapped open with the wild panic of someone expecting violence. "I'm sorry," Emily gasped, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. "I didn't mean to make noise. I'll be quieter." "You don't need to be sorry for dreaming," Rebecca said softly, maintaining her distance until Emily's breathing slowed. "Dreams aren't something you can control." Over the following days, Rebecca discovered the extent of Emily's conditioning. The child ate only when explicitly given permission, asked before using the bathroom, and flinched whenever Rebecca moved too quickly. She hoarded food under the bed, crackers, apple slices, anything she could save in case meals stopped coming. When Rebecca gently suggested Emily might want to take a bath, the child's entire body went rigid with terror. "I can wash myself in the sink," Emily said quickly. "I don't need much water. I won't waste anything." It took Rebecca 3 days to understand that Emily associated bathtubs with punishment. At the Henderson house, children who misbehaved were held underwater until they nearly drowned, then told they should be grateful their parents didn't let them drown completely. Rebecca found herself learning to move slowly, speak softly, and give Emily constant choices about her environment. Did she want the lights on or off? Did she want to sit by the window or away from it? Did she want Rebecca to stay in the room or give her space? Every decision, no matter how small, was Emily's to make. Slowly, carefully, trust began to build in microscopic increments. Emily started sleeping on top of the bed instead of beside it. She began eating meals without asking permission first. One morning, Rebecca found her curled up in the reading nook by the window, looking through a picture book about a lost puppy who finds his way home. "Do you like that story?" Rebecca asked, settling into the opposite corner of the window seat. "The puppy gets lost, but someone finds him and keeps him," Emily said, her finger tracing the illustrations. "Even though he's dirty and scared, they clean him up and give him a name and let him stay forever. That's what families do," Rebecca said gently. "They keep each other safe." Emily looked up with those old wise eyes. "Even if the puppy has bad dreams and makes mistakes?" "Especially then." For a moment, Emily's face transformed with something approaching hope. But then the careful walls slammed back into place, and she was once again the guarded child who trusted nothing and no one completely. Rebecca threw herself into creating legal protection for Emily with the same intensity she'd once devoted to building her company. She hired the best family attorneys in Chicago, prepared adoption paperwork, and began the process of obtaining legal guardianship. Her lawyers assured her it would be straightforward. She had unlimited resources, a spotless background check, and clearly Emily was thriving in her care. They were wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while Emily was working on a coloring book at the kitchen counter, humming quietly to herself for the first time since Rebecca had found her. The lawyer's voice carried an urgency that made Rebecca's stomach clench with dread. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Emily's father has filed a petition claiming you kidnapped his daughter. He's hired a legal team and they're moving fast." Rebecca stepped into her office, closing the door so Emily wouldn't overhear. "That's impossible. He sold her to traffickers. He abandoned her. He's claiming he placed her in a licensed foster home for her safety while he dealt with mental health issues. He says the Hendersons told him she ran away, and he's been searching for her ever since. He's painted himself as a reformed father, desperately trying to reunite with his lost child." The lawyer's voice continued, but Rebecca could barely process the words. Jacob Carter, the man who'd terrorized Allison, who'd sold his own daughter to human traffickers, was now presenting himself as a concerned parent whose rights had been violated by a wealthy woman with a savior complex. "There's more," the lawyer continued. "He's given interviews to 3 major news outlets. The story is already going viral. Billionaire tech CEO accused of kidnapping father's child. The narrative is that you're using Emily for publicity, that you staged the restaurant encounter for social media attention." Rebecca's hands began to shake. "That's insane. Anyone who sees Emily can tell she's been abused and neglected. He's got medical records claiming her injuries happened after she went missing from the foster home. He's suggesting you've been coaching her to tell lies about her past. And Rebecca, there's something else. He's filed for emergency custody. The hearing is Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. 2 days to prove that a traumatized child belonged with the woman who'd rescued her rather than the father who'd sold her into slavery. 2 days to convince a court system that had already failed Emily once that she deserved protection rather than reunification with her abuser. When Rebecca emerged from her office, Emily looked up from her coloring with immediate concern. Children who'd survived trauma became experts at reading adult moods, and Emily's survival instincts were finely tuned to detect approaching danger. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, setting down her crayon. Rebecca forced a smile, but she could see in Emily's eyes that the child wasn't fooled. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just some grown-up business I need to handle." But Emily's face was already closing off, the tentative trust they'd built dissolving, as she recognized the signs of adults who were about to make decisions that would change her life without consulting her preferences or safety. That night, Emily didn't sleep on the bed. She returned to the floor, fully dressed in the clothes she'd worn the day Rebecca found her, her small backpack packed with the few possessions she'd accumulated. She was preparing to run again, because experience had taught her that happiness was always temporary and safety was always an illusion. Rebecca sat in the chair beside her, watching Emily's fitful sleep and wondering how she was going to protect a child from a legal system that seemed designed to prioritize parental rights over children's safety. Outside the windows, Chicago sparkled with its usual indifferent beauty, millions of lights representing millions of lives, most of them untouched by the kind of systemic cruelty that could tear a child away from the first safe home she'd known in years. In the morning, Emily's packed bag sat by the door like an accusation, and Rebecca knew that their peaceful interlude was about to end. The real fight was just beginning, and this time, she wasn't just battling bureaucracy and legal paperwork. She was fighting a man who'd already proven he was willing to sacrifice his own daughter for money, and who now had the full power of parental rights law on his side. Emily said nothing about the bag, but she stayed close to Rebecca all morning, as if physical proximity might somehow protect them both from the storm that was gathering around them. Neither of them spoke about Thursday's hearing, but it hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread, ready to cut their fragile family apart before it had truly begun to heal. The Cook County Family Court building stood like a fortress of bureaucratic indifference, its grey concrete walls and narrow windows suggesting that justice here was dispensed with the same warmth as a parking ticket. Rebecca held Emily's hand as they climbed the steps, feeling the child's fingers tremble despite her outward composure. Emily had insisted on wearing her best dress, a simple blue outfit Rebecca had bought her the week before, as if proper clothing might somehow protect her from what was about to happen. "Remember," Rebecca whispered as they approached the courtroom doors, "no matter what anyone says in there, you tell the truth. The truth is the only thing that matters." Emily nodded solemnly, but her grip tightened on Rebecca's hand. What if they don't believe the truth? It was a question Rebecca couldn't answer, because she'd been wondering the same thing since her lawyer had called with increasingly grim updates about Jacob Carter's media campaign. The man who'd sold his daughter to human traffickers had somehow transformed himself into a sympathetic figure, a reformed father seeking redemption, a victim of a wealthy woman's misguided savior complex. Inside the courtroom, Rebecca's worst fears materialized. Jacob Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, clean-shaven and wearing a modest suit that suggested humble circumstances rather than the calculated cruelty she knew lay beneath his reformed exterior. He'd lost weight, gotten his teeth fixed, and learned to project the kind of quiet dignity that played well for cameras and judges. When he saw Emily, his face transformed with what appeared to be genuine paternal love. "Emily, sweetheart," he said, rising from his chair with arms extended, "Daddy's been looking everywhere for you." Emily's entire body went rigid, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Rebecca felt the child's hand go ice-cold in hers, but Emily's face remained carefully blank, the expression of someone who'd learned that showing fear only made punishments worse. "It's okay," Rebecca whispered, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Judge Patricia Holloway entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years making decisions about children's lives based on incomplete information and imperfect systems. She was known for her strict adherence to family reunification policies, believing that children belonged with their biological parents unless absolutely proven otherwise. Jacob's lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Sandra Mills, painted a picture of a loving father whose daughter had been stolen by a wealthy dilettante with too much money and too little understanding of family law. She presented Jacob as a man who'd struggled with depression after his ex-girlfriend's death, who'd made the difficult decision to place Emily in foster care while he sought treatment, only to have his daughter vanish before he could reclaim her. "My client has spent the last year searching for Emily," Mills declared, her voice ringing with manufactured indignation. "He's attended therapy, maintained steady employment, and prepared a loving home for his daughter's return. Instead, he finds her living with a stranger who, despite her good intentions, has no legal right to custody." Rebecca's lawyer, David Chen, attempted to counter with evidence of Emily's condition when she was found, the malnutrition, the signs of abuse, the terror in her eyes. But Jacob's team had prepared for this, presenting medical records that suggested Emily's injuries occurred after she ran away from the foster home, implying that months on the street had caused her trauma rather than years of systematic abuse. When it came time for Emily to speak, Judge Holloway's expression softened slightly. "Emily, I know this is scary, but I need you to tell me the truth about where you want to live." Emily stood in the witness box, her small figure dwarfed by the formal proceedings around her. Rebecca could see her struggling between honesty and survival, between the truth that might save her and the instinct that told her powerful adults always got their way, regardless of what children wanted. "I want to stay with Rebecca," Emily said quietly, her voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. "She keeps me safe." Jacob's performance was masterful. his face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine pain, tears sliding down his cheeks as he looked at his daughter with perfectly calibrated heartbreak. "Emily, honey, I know I made mistakes when I was sick, but I'm better now. I'm your daddy, and I love you more than anything in the world. But you hurt me," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "You locked me in the dark place and you didn't feed me, and you sold me to the bad people who made me work all the time." Mills was ready for this. "Your Honor, the child has clearly been coached. These allegations are consistent with false memory syndrome often seen in children who've been influenced by well-meaning but misguided adults. My client was receiving treatment for depression during the time period Emily describes, with medical records to prove his whereabouts. The medical records were impressive. Therapy appointments, prescription medications, even a brief voluntary psychiatric hold that perfectly coincided with the timeline of Emily's worst abuse. Rebecca watched in horror as Jacob's team systematically dismantled Emily's testimony with paperwork that painted him as a man seeking help rather than a monster inflicting torture. The Henderson foster family has provided sworn affidavits stating that Emily was a troubled child who frequently told elaborate lies to gain attention, Mills continued. They report that she stole food, destroyed property, and eventually ran away despite their best efforts to provide a stable home environment. Rebecca's lawyer fought back with everything he had, but the legal system operated on documentation rather than intuition, on official records rather than a child's terrified eyes. Jacob had spent months preparing for this moment, creating a paper trail that transformed him from predator to victim, while painting Emily as a damaged child whose memories couldn't be trusted. The most devastating moment came when Judge Holloway asked Emily directly about the Hendersons. "Emily, the records show that Mr. and Mrs. Henderson reported you missing when you ran away from their home. They say they were worried about you and called the police to help find you. Can you tell me why you left their house?" Emily's composure finally cracked. "They made us work all day and they barely fed us, and they said the older kids had to do special jobs with strange men, and Mrs. Henderson said I'd be doing those jobs soon because I was getting old enough and I got scared, so I ran away." But Mills had prepared for this too. "Your Honor, the Hendersons have provided character references from 3 other foster children currently in their care, all of whom describe a loving, supportive home environment. Additionally, Emily's claims about special jobs are consistent with trafficking paranoia, often seen in children who've been exposed to inappropriate media content." Rebecca watched helplessly as Emily's truth was dissected and dismissed, transformed from lived experience into symptoms of psychological damage that required professional intervention. Every piece of evidence that should have protected Emily was reinterpreted as proof that she needed to be removed from Rebecca's enabling environment and returned to her father's structured care. When Judge Holloway announced her decision, Rebecca felt the world tilt sideways. While Ms. Monroe's intentions appear genuine, the law is clear regarding parental rights. Mr. Carter has demonstrated his commitment to rehabilitation and his ability to provide appropriate care for his daughter. Emily will be returned to her father's custody immediately, with supervised visitation rights for Ms. Monroe, pending a full psychological evaluation. Emily's scream cut through the courtroom like a blade. "No, please don't make me go with him. Rebecca, don't let them take me." But the bailiff was already moving forward, and Jacob was standing with his arms outstretched, tears streaming down his face, in a performance that convinced everyone except the child who knew the truth about what happened when those arms closed around her. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion, as Emily struggled against the bailiff's gentle but firm grip. "Daddy's going to take such good care of you. We're going to be a real family again." Rebecca lunged forward, but her lawyer caught her arm. "Don't," he whispered urgently. "Any interference now will only make things worse for her." Emily's eyes found Rebecca's across the courtroom, and in them Rebecca saw not just fear but betrayal, the devastating realization that even the adults who claimed to love you couldn't protect you from the systems designed to destroy you. Emily had trusted Rebecca with her truth, and the truth hadn't been enough. "I'm sorry," Rebecca called out as Emily was led away, but she didn't know if the child could hear her over her own sobbing. "I'm so sorry, baby. I won't stop fighting for you." Jacob turned back at the courtroom door, Emily limp in his arms like a broken doll. For just a moment his mask slipped, and Rebecca saw the cold calculation in his eyes. the look of a man who'd won a game he'd been playing since the day Emily was born. Then the mask was back in place, and he was once again the grateful father, reunited with his beloved daughter. That night, Rebecca sat in Emily's empty bedroom, surrounded by the toys and books and clothes that had represented hope for a different kind of life. The bed was still unmade from the morning, when Emily had been deciding between two different hair ribbons for court, believing that somehow the right choice might help convince the judge to let her stay. Rebecca's phone buzzed with notifications, news alerts about the heartwarming reunion between father and daughter, social media posts praising the court's decision to prioritize family preservation over wealth and privilege. The narrative had been written before the hearing even began, and Emily's voice had been lost in the noise of adult agendas and systemic failures. But Rebecca remembered the terror in Emily's eyes as she was carried away, and she knew that this wasn't over. The legal system might have failed, but that didn't mean she had to accept defeat. Emily was still out there, still in danger, still believing that somehow Rebecca might find a way to save her. The real fight was just beginning. The apartment where Jacob Carter had taken Emily was a meticulously crafted stage set, designed to fool social workers and court-appointed observers who came for their mandatory check-ins. Located in a middle-class neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side, it featured cheerful yellow walls, educational posters, and a refrigerator covered with Emily's artwork, drawings she'd never actually made, but which Jacob had commissioned from a local art student to create the illusion of a happy, creative child. Emily's bedroom was particularly convincing, painted in soft pink with a canopy bed, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, and photographs of father-daughter activities that had been staged during supervised visits before the custody hearing. Anyone conducting a cursory inspection would see evidence of a loving parent who'd gone to great expense to create the perfect environment for his recovering daughter. But Emily knew the truth behind the performance. The bedroom door locked from the outside. The stuffed animals contained hidden cameras that recorded her every movement. The cheerful artwork covered walls that were soundproof to muffle screams, and the canopy bed's pretty pink curtains concealed restraints that Jacob used when Emily's behavior required correction. During the day, when social workers might visit, Emily was coached to play the role of a grateful daughter reunited with her reformed father. She learned which phrases would satisfy the adults who checked on her welfare. "Daddy's teaching me so much. I'm glad to be home. I was confused before, but now I understand." She practiced sitting close to Jacob without flinching, smiling on command, and speaking in the bright, cheerful voice that officials expected from a child who was supposedly thriving in her father's care. But at night, when the observers went home and the performance ended, Emily discovered that Jacob's cruelty had evolved during their separation. The physical abuse that had terrorized her as a toddler had been refined into something more sophisticated and harder to detect. He understood that visible injuries would raise questions, so instead he used methods that left no marks, holding her underwater in the bathtub until she nearly drowned, forcing her to stand motionless for hours while he screamed at her about her worthlessness, locking her in the soundproof closet he'd constructed specifically for punishment. "You cost me a lot of money," he told her during one of his nightly lectures, his voice calm and conversational as Emily stood naked and shivering in the center of her bedroom while he inspected her for any signs of defiance. "The lawyers, the apartment, all the preparation to get you back, that was expensive, and now you're going to earn every penny back." Emily had learned not to ask what he meant by earning back the money, because questions resulted in immediate punishment. But she understood from the way strange men sometimes visited the apartment late at night, and from the camera equipment Jacob had installed in what he called the special room, that her fears about the Henderson house had been preparation for something much worse. Meanwhile, across the city, Rebecca threw every resource at her disposal into the desperate search for evidence that would convince a court to remove Emily from Jacob's custody. She hired private investigators, child psychologists, and former FBI agents who specialized in trafficking cases. She offered rewards for information about the Henderson foster home and Jacob's criminal associates. She even reached out to underground networks of abuse survivors who might have information about Jacob's activities. But Jacob had spent months preparing for scrutiny, and his operation was designed to be invisible to conventional investigation. The Henderson house had been shut down, and its operators had vanished, taking with them any records that might have corroborated Emily's testimony. Jacob's financial records showed a legitimate income from a warehouse job, with no suspicious transactions or unexplained wealth. His therapy records painted him as a man genuinely committed to rehabilitation and reunion with his daughter. Rebecca's private investigators hit dead ends at every turn. Jacob's neighbors described him as a quiet, devoted, single father who was clearly working hard to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. Emily's school records showed steady attendance and academic progress that suggested a stable home environment. Even the social workers assigned to monitor the case reported positive interactions between father and daughter, noting Emily's apparent comfort in Jacob's presence and her expressed gratitude for their reunion. What the officials didn't see were the hours of rehearsal that preceded each visit, the careful scripting of every interaction, the consequences Emily faced if she deviated from her assigned role by even a single word or gesture. They didn't witness the way Emily's hands shook when she thought no one was watching, or how she flinched whenever Jacob moved suddenly, or the way she hoarded food in her school backpack as if she expected meals to stop coming at any moment. 3 weeks after the custody hearing, Rebecca received a phone call that sent her racing across the city, with her heart pounding against her ribs. Emily had been hospitalized after collapsing at school, and while Jacob claimed she'd simply been fighting a flu virus, Rebecca suspected something more sinister was happening. At Chicago Children's Hospital, Rebecca found Emily in a private room connected to an IV drip and looking smaller than ever against the white hospital sheets. Jacob sat beside the bed, playing the role of concerned father with practiced ease, but Rebecca noticed how Emily's body tensed whenever he touched her hand or smoothed her hair. "She's been having some digestive issues," Jacob explained to the attending physician, his voice heavy with parental worry. "Poor thing can't seem to keep food down. I've been so worried about her." But when Rebecca caught Emily's eye, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Emily was trying to communicate something urgent, her gaze darting meaningfully toward the bedside table, where a glass of water sat innocuously beside a small bouquet of flowers Jacob had brought from home. Understanding flashed through Rebecca's mind with horrifying clarity. Emily wasn't sick from a virus. She was being systematically poisoned. Jacob had found a way to control and weaken her that would appear to be nothing more than the after-effects of trauma and displacement. A concerned father dealing with his daughter's mysterious illness while heroically maintaining his commitment to her care. "I need to speak with you privately," Rebecca told the doctor, her voice carefully controlled to avoid alerting Jacob to her suspicions. In the hallway, Rebecca explained her concerns about Emily's previous testimony regarding abuse, the suspicious timing of her illness, and the pattern of control she recognized from her research into trafficking operations. But the doctor, while sympathetic, explained that without concrete evidence of poisoning, they couldn't act on suspicions alone. "Her blood work shows some irregularities that could be consistent with intentional ingestion of certain substances," the doctor admitted quietly, "but they could also be explained by stress, malnutrition from her time on the streets, or any number of legitimate medical conditions. Without proof of deliberate poisoning or a confession from the child herself, there's nothing we can do except treat her symptoms and release her to her legal guardian." Rebecca returned to Emily's room feeling helpless and desperate. Jacob had stepped out to make phone calls, leaving Emily alone for the first time since Rebecca had arrived. She approached the bed carefully, not wanting to frighten the child, who had already been through so much betrayal. "Emily, sweetheart, are you okay? Really okay?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she glanced nervously toward the door before whispering, "He puts things in my food when I don't do what he wants. I've had things that make me sick. And he said he's going to start having visitors soon, special visitors who pay money to play games with little girls." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Emily was describing not just abuse, but the beginning stages of commercial sexual exploitation, and she was trapped in a system that prioritized parental rights over children's safety, documentation over intuition, procedure over protection. "I won't let that happen," Rebecca whispered, taking Emily's small hand in hers. "I promise you I will find a way to get you out of there." But Emily's eyes held no hope, only the resigned acceptance of someone who'd learned that adult promises were meaningless when stacked against legal documents and systemic indifference. "You can't," she said simply. "He's too smart, and nobody believes kids like me." When Jacob returned, his mask of concerned fatherhood firmly in place, Rebecca was forced to watch helplessly as Emily transformed back into the compliant, grateful daughter she'd been trained to portray. The performance was flawless. Emily thanked her father for bringing her favorite flowers, smiled when he kissed her forehead, and expressed eagerness to return home, where she could rest properly. As they left the hospital together, Jacob's arm protectively around Emily's shoulders, Rebecca noticed the way Emily's free hand trailed behind her, fingers moving in what looked like random gestures. But Rebecca recognized the pattern. Emily was spelling out letters in sign language, a skill she must have learned from one of the other children during her various placements. HELPME. The message was clear, desperate, and utterly heartbreaking. Emily was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by systems designed to protect her, but operated by people who couldn't see past Jacob's carefully constructed facade. She was being prepared for horrors that Rebecca could barely imagine, and every day that passed brought her closer to a fate that would destroy whatever innocence she had left. That night, Rebecca sat in her empty penthouse, staring at the city lights, while her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. Legal channels had failed, social services had been deceived, law enforcement saw no evidence of crime, but Emily was still out there, still fighting, still hoping that somehow the promise Rebecca had made in the restaurant might still come true. She picked up her phone and began making calls to people who operated outside conventional systems. Former police officers who'd been frustrated by legal limitations, journalists who specialized in exposing trafficking networks, activists who'd learned that sometimes protecting children required breaking rules that were designed to protect predators. The fight for Emily's life was about to enter territory where victory would require Rebecca to risk everything she'd built, everything she was, for the sake of a child who'd already suffered more than any human being should have to endure. Rebecca's transformation from law-abiding citizen to someone willing to operate in the shadows began with a phone call to Marcus Rivera, a former Chicago police detective who'd been forced to resign after his aggressive pursuit of child trafficking cases had put him at odds with department politics and prosecutorial caution. Marcus understood what Rebecca was learning the hard way, that sometimes the systems designed to protect children became the very mechanisms that enabled their destruction. The problem isn't that people don't care, Marcus explained during their clandestine meeting in a Southside diner that served coffee strong enough to fuel desperation and conversations that couldn't happen in official venues. The problem is that predators have learned to game the system better than the system has learned to catch them. Guys like Jacob Carter study family court procedures the way other criminals study bank security systems. Marcus had been tracking Jacob for 2 years, ever since a tip from a sex trafficking survivor had identified him as someone who groomed children for commercial exploitation. But Jacob's operation was insidiously clever. He never directly sold children to buyers. Instead, he facilitated private adoption arrangements and therapeutic foster placements that placed vulnerable children with people who paid premium prices for access to victims who had no legal protections and no voices that would be believed. The genius of his system, Marcus continued, stirring sugar into coffee that probably didn't need additional bitterness, is that everything appears legitimate on paper. He identifies damaged kids in the system, kids whose testimonies have already been discredited or who've been labeled as difficult placements. Then he positions himself as their savior, the reformed parent, the therapeutic specialist, the family friend who's willing to provide stability when no one else will. Rebecca listened with growing horror as Marcus described a network that operated with corporate efficiency and legal protection. Jacob didn't just abuse children, he provided them to others who paid extraordinary sums for the privilege of accessing victims who couldn't escape, couldn't report, and wouldn't be believed if they tried. Emily's not his first, Marcus said, sliding a manila folder across the sticky diner table. There have been at least 6 others over the past 5 years, all children who'd already been through the system, all kids whose stories were already considered unreliable. The folder contained photographs and case files that Rebecca couldn't look at for more than a few seconds without feeling physically sick. Children who'd disappeared from supposedly safe placements only to surface months later in situations that authorities had classified as voluntary runaways or placement disruptions rather than abductions. Some had eventually aged out of the system and vanished completely. Others had been found dead under circumstances that were ruled accidents or suicides despite evidence suggesting otherwise. "Why hasn't anyone stopped this?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because it requires believing children who've been systematically discredited, and it requires prosecutors who are willing to build cases based on patterns rather than individual incidents with overwhelming evidence. Most importantly, it requires people in power to admit that the systems they oversee are being used to facilitate the very crimes they're supposed to prevent. Marcus explained that several previous investigations had been shut down due to insufficient evidence or unreliable witnesses, but he suspected the real reason was that Jacob's operation implicated people with enough influence to protect themselves and their network. Some of his clients weren't just wealthy individuals with disturbing proclivities. They were politicians, judges, business leaders, and law enforcement officials who had too much to lose if their participation became public knowledge. "So, what do we do?" Rebecca asked, though the question felt rhetorical in a world where legal protections seem designed to shield predators from consequences. "We get Emily to safety first, and we worry about legal justification later," Marcus said bluntly, "because every day she stays in that apartment brings her closer to something she'll never recover from, assuming she survives it at all." Rebecca felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, not breaking but hardening into a determination that felt almost frightening in its intensity. She'd spent her entire adult life following rules, building success through legitimate channels, believing that systems worked for people who played by established procedures. But Emily was drowning in those very systems, and following proper channels would mean watching a child be destroyed, while paperwork moved through bureaucratic processes designed to prioritize procedure over protection. "What would it take?" she asked quietly. Marcus studied her face with the careful attention of someone who'd seen good people make desperate choices for the right reasons. "It would mean accepting that you might never be able to return to your old life. It would mean operating outside legal boundaries in ways that could result in federal charges if we're caught. And it would mean trusting people who exist in spaces where traditional morality gets complicated by survival necessities." Rebecca thought about Emily's eyes in the hospital, about the way her small hand had spelled out "help me" with the desperate precision of someone who understood that this might be her last chance to communicate her need for rescue. She thought about Allison's voice on that final phone call, trusting Rebecca with the most precious thing in her world. She thought about the promise she'd made in the restaurant, and the way Emily's face had transformed with hope before the legal system had crushed that hope under the weight of procedural indifference. "Tell me what you need," she said. The plan Marcus outlined was complex, dangerous, and probably illegal in ways that would result in serious federal charges if discovered. It involved surveillance technology that wasn't available through legitimate channels, communication networks that operated outside government monitoring, and extraction protocols that had been developed by people who specialized in removing trafficking victims from situations where conventional law enforcement had failed. Rebecca would need to liquidate significant assets to fund an operation that might not succeed and would definitely destroy her if it failed. She would need to trust people whose real names she'd never learn and whose methods she might not be able to stomach. Most importantly, she would need to accept that success might mean living the rest of her life as someone who'd chosen to save one child at the cost of everything else she'd built. "There's something else you need to understand," Marcus said as their conversation drew to a close. "This isn't just about Emily anymore. If we do this right, if we document everything correctly, we might be able to bring down an entire network that's been operating with impunity for years. But that also means we'll be making enemies of people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints about eliminating threats to their operation." Rebecca nodded, understanding that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. But she also understood that some lines were meant to be crossed, that some rules existed to protect systems rather than people, and that sometimes love required choosing criminal acts over legal compliance. Over the following week, Rebecca's penthouse became a command center for an operation that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who'd been dining at Le Bernardin just months earlier. Surveillance equipment monitored Jacob's apartment from multiple angles. Communication devices connected her to a network of former law enforcement officers, trafficking survivors, and underground activists who specialized in extractions that couldn't be accomplished through official channels. She learned that Emily's situation had deteriorated rapidly since the hospital visit. Jacob had accelerated his timeline, apparently concerned that too much scrutiny might interfere with his plans. The surveillance showed men visiting the apartment at strange hours, staying for brief periods, before leaving with satisfied expressions that made Rebecca's stomach churn with rage and helplessness. Emily rarely appeared in the surveillance footage, but when she did, her physical deterioration was shocking. She moved like someone much older, with the careful gait of someone whose body had been systematically damaged. Her face had developed the blank expression that trafficking survivors called the shutdown, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed victims to survive experiences that would otherwise shatter their minds completely. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Rebecca's surveillance team intercepted communications, suggesting that Emily was about to be moved to a more permanent placement out of state. The language was coded, but Marcus translated it with grim certainty. Emily was about to be sold to buyers who specialized in long-term victims, children who would disappear into networks designed to keep them hidden until they were no longer useful. "We move tonight," Marcus said during an emergency conference call that included voices Rebecca had learned to recognize but faces she'd never seen. "Once she's moved out of Chicago, we'll lose her forever. The people who run those facilities don't keep records, and they don't let mistakes live to testify." Rebecca sat in her office, surrounded by the awards and photographs that documented a successful career built on innovation and legitimate achievement, knowing that in a few hours she would either save Emily's life or destroy her own in the attempt. She thought about Allison, who'd trusted her with a promise that had seemed simple at the time, but had grown into something that demanded everything she was willing to sacrifice. She picked up her phone and made the call that would set everything in motion. "Do it," she said simply. In 12 hours, Emily Carter would either be free or Rebecca Monroe would be a federal fugitive. But for the first time since that night in the restaurant, Rebecca felt like she was finally keeping the promise she'd made to a dying friend and a desperate child who deserved better than a world that treated her suffering as acceptable collateral damage in systems designed to protect everyone, except the people who needed protection most. The call came at 2:47 a.m., cutting through Rebecca's restless sleep with the urgency of someone who understood that seconds could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe. Emily's voice was barely a whisper, so faint that Rebecca had to press the phone against her ear and hold her breath to make out the words. "Rebecca, I'm in the closet with the phone he doesn't know about. They're coming for me in the morning. Please, please help me." The line went dead, but those 15 words contained everything Rebecca needed to know. Emily had somehow managed to access a communication device, probably a burner phone that Marcus's team had smuggled to her during one of their surveillance operations, and she was calling in the promise that Rebecca had made in the restaurant months ago. Tomorrow, Jacob would transfer her to buyers who would take her so far from Chicago that no rescue operation would ever find her. Rebecca's penthouse erupted into controlled chaos as Marcus's extraction team activated protocols they'd spent weeks preparing. Former Special Forces operators checked equipment with the precision of people who understood that Emily's life depended on split-second timing and flawless execution. Electronic surveillance specialists confirmed Jacob's location and the apartment's security systems. Medical personnel prepared for a victim who would likely require immediate trauma care. "Remember," Marcus said as the team gathered for final preparations, "this isn't a law enforcement operation. We're not making arrests or gathering evidence for prosecution. We're extracting a trafficking victim from an active crime scene, and our only priority is getting her to safety. Everything else is secondary." The apartment building where Jacob held Emily was a fortress designed to prevent exactly this kind of rescue. Security cameras monitored every entrance. Electronic locks required specialized bypass equipment, and the soundproofing that concealed Emily's screams would also muffle any sounds of an extraction operation. But Marcus's team had been planning for these obstacles, using surveillance data to identify weaknesses in Jacob's security and timing their approach to minimize the risk of discovery. At 4:15 a.m., when Chicago's streets were empty except for shift workers and insomniacs, the extraction began. Rebecca waited in a van parked 3 blocks away, monitoring communications and watching feeds from body cameras that showed her rescuers moving through the building with ghost-like precision. Her hands shook as she watched Marcus disable the apartment's security system while other team members positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the building. The apartment door opened silently, revealing the staged domestic scene that had fooled social workers and court officials for months. But the team moved past the fake family photographs and cheerful decorations heading directly for the bedroom where surveillance had indicated Emily was being held. What they found there would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her life. Emily was chained to a radiator in what Jacob called the preparation room, a space hidden behind a false wall that contained equipment designed for recording the kind of videos that commanded premium prices in underground markets. She was barely conscious, her small body bearing fresh injuries that suggested Jacob had been conditioning her for the transfer that was scheduled to happen in just a few hours. "Emily, sweetheart, I'm here to take you home," Marcus whispered as he carefully cut through the restraints that held her. "Rebecca sent me. You're safe now." Emily's eyes opened with the sluggish confusion of someone who'd been heavily sedated, but when she recognized Marcus from surveillance photographs Rebecca had shown her, her face transformed with desperate hope. She couldn't speak. Her throat was too damaged from screaming, but she gripped Marcus's hand with surprising strength for someone who'd been systematically weakened by months of abuse. The extraction should have been simple at that point. Emily was secured, the apartment was cleared, and the team had a clear escape route to vehicles waiting outside. But as they moved toward the exit, Jacob returned unexpectedly from what surveillance had indicated would be an all-night business meeting with his trafficking partners. The confrontation in the apartment's hallway lasted less than 30 seconds, but it changed everything. Jacob saw Emily in Marcus's arms and understood immediately that his carefully constructed operation was collapsing around him. Instead of surrendering or attempting to flee, he reached for a weapon that he'd hidden behind a picture frame, a gun that he'd obviously planned to use if his operation was ever discovered. "She belongs to me," Jacob snarled, his mask of reformed fatherhood finally slipping to reveal the monster that Emily had always known lurked beneath the surface. "I paid good money to get her back, and I've got buyers who've already paid for delivery. You're stealing merchandise that's already been sold." Marcus's team member reacted with the trained reflexes of someone who'd faced armed predators before, but in the confined space of the apartment hallway, there was no way to neutralize Jacob without risking Emily's safety. For a moment, that felt like eternity. Emily hung between the man who'd tormented her and the people who'd come to save her, while Jacob's finger tightened on a trigger that would end her life rather than allow her to escape. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute clarity. "I just want to go home." Those words seemed to break something fundamental in Jacob's psychology. He'd spent years convincing himself that Emily was property rather than a person, merchandise rather than a child, a commodity that existed solely for his profit and pleasure. But hearing her voice, not the rehearsed scripts he'd forced her to memorize, but her own authentic expression of her deepest need, apparently reminded him that he was pointing a gun at a 7-year-old girl who'd never done anything except survive the horrors he'd inflicted on her. The gun wavered, and in that moment of hesitation, Marcus's partner acted. The weapon was secured, Jacob was restrained, and Emily collapsed into Marcus's arms with the boneless exhaustion of someone whose survival had required strength she no longer possessed. But the rescue was only the beginning of Emily's road to recovery. The medical team that examined her at a private facility outside the city discovered injuries that would require months of treatment and psychological trauma that might take years to heal. Jacob's conditioning had been designed to break Emily's spirit so completely that she would never again believe herself worthy of protection or love. In addition to the physical abuse, Emily had been systematically exposed to psychological manipulation techniques that convinced victims they were responsible for their own exploitation. Jacob had spent months telling Emily that Rebecca had abandoned her, that the rescue attempt proved Rebecca was only interested in publicity, that no one could ever love a child who'd been used the way Emily had been used. "She keeps asking if you're really coming back," the trauma counselor told Rebecca during one of their daily briefings about Emily's condition. "She's been conditioned to believe that every rescue is temporary, that eventually she'll be returned to her abusers." Jacob convinced her that she's too damaged for anyone to want permanently. Rebecca spent every possible moment at Emily's bedside, reading stories and playing gentle games and simply being present, while Emily slowly remembered what safety felt like. The process was heartbreaking. Emily would sometimes flinch when Rebecca moved too quickly, or refuse food because she'd been trained to eat only when given explicit permission, or apologize repeatedly for existing in ways that might be inconvenient for the adults around her. But gradually, painfully, healing began. Emily started sleeping through the night without screaming. She began eating meals without asking permission first. She drew pictures that showed sunshine and flowers instead of dark closets and locked doors. Most importantly, she began to believe that Rebecca's presence was permanent rather than temporary, that this rescue was different from the false hopes that had been dangled in front of her before. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the rescue, when Emily woke up from a nap and found Rebecca reading in the chair beside her bed. Instead of the careful greeting she'd been trained to offer, Emily looked at Rebecca with clear eyes and said something that made Rebecca's heart skip with hope. "I had a dream about Mama," Emily said, her voice stronger than it had been since the rescue. "She said you kept your promise. She said she's not worried about me anymore because you're here." Rebecca couldn't speak around the tears that threatened to choke her, but she managed to nod and reach for Emily's hand. This time Emily didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she held on with the trust of someone who was finally beginning to believe that some promises were meant to be kept, that some adults could be trusted with a child's safety, and that love could exist without conditions or limitations. Outside their private room, Marcus was coordinating with federal agents who'd been investigating Jacob's trafficking network for years. The evidence gathered during the rescue had provided the breakthrough they needed to dismantle an operation that had victimized dozens of children across multiple states. But for Rebecca, the only victory that mattered was the small hand that held hers and the voice that said, "Thank you for coming back for me." The legal challenges weren't over. Jacob's lawyers were already claiming that Emily had been kidnapped rather than rescued, and they were demanding her immediate return to his custody. But this time, Rebecca had evidence that even the most reluctant prosecutor couldn't ignore, and Emily had allies who understood that sometimes protecting children required adults to risk everything for the sake of what was right, rather than what was legal. 2 years later, Rebecca stood in the kitchen of their modest home in Evanston, a quiet neighborhood north of Chicago, where Emily could attend school without reporters following her to document her recovery. The house was nothing like Rebecca's former penthouse. It had 3 bedrooms, a small backyard where Emily grew tomatoes in raised beds, and neighbors who knew them simply as Rebecca and Emily Monroe, a family who'd moved to the area for the excellent schools and tree-lined streets that made childhood feel safe again. The transformation in both their lives had been gradual but profound. Rebecca had liquidated most of her business empire to fund Emily's medical care and legal fees, but she'd discovered that success measured in a child's laughter was infinitely more valuable than wealth accumulated in corporate accounts. She now worked as a consultant for organizations that specialized in trafficking prevention, using her technology expertise to develop systems that could identify vulnerable children before predators found them. Emily, now 9 years old, bore few visible signs of the trauma that had once defined her existence. She was small for her age. The malnutrition and stress of her early years had affected her physical development, but her eyes sparkled with the curiosity and hope that belonged in a child's face. She attended therapy twice a week, not because she was broken, but because healing was an ongoing process that required professional support and careful attention. The legal resolution had taken 18 months, but it had been comprehensive and devastating for Jacob's network. Federal prosecutors had used the evidence gathered during Emily's rescue to build cases against 43 individuals across 12 states, dismantling what the FBI described as one of the most sophisticated child trafficking operations they'd ever encountered. Jacob himself had received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm children. The Henderson foster home operators had been arrested in Mexico, where they'd fled after closing their operation in Chicago. They faced federal charges for trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy, with dozens of former victims testifying about years of forced labor and abuse. Most importantly, the legal precedents established by Emily's case had resulted in reforms to the foster care system that made it much harder for predators to exploit bureaucratic loopholes. "Rebecca, can you help me with this math problem?" Emily called from the dining room table where she was working on homework that would have been impossible for her to comprehend just 2 years earlier. Her reading and math skills had been severely delayed by years of trauma and interrupted education, but intensive tutoring and her own determined intelligence had helped her catch up to grade level. "Of course, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and joining Emily at the table where textbooks and colored pencils created the kind of cheerful chaos that belonged in a home where learning was safe and mistakes were opportunities rather than reasons for punishment. The math problem was about sharing. If a farmer had 60 apples and wanted to divide them equally among 8 families, how many apples would each family receive? Emily worked through the division carefully, using the multiplication tables she'd memorized, with the same determination she'd once applied to survival on Chicago's streets. 7.5, she said confidently, then looked up at Rebecca for confirmation. But you can't really give someone half an apple, so maybe the farmer keeps the extra 4 and makes them into pie for everyone to share. Rebecca smiled at Emily's solution, which demonstrated not just mathematical understanding, but the kind of generous thinking that belonged to someone who'd learned that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded. That's exactly right. You're getting so good at these problems. Emily beamed with pride, then returned to her homework while Rebecca started dinner. Their evening routine had become one of Rebecca's greatest treasures. Simple, predictable activities that allowed Emily to experience the kind of childhood stability she'd never known existed. Homework at the dining room table, dinner cooked together while Emily chattered about her day at school, bath time with lavender bubbles that made Emily giggle, and bedtime stories read in Emily's room where the walls were painted with rainbows and covered with her own artwork. The bedroom was particularly significant because Emily had designed it herself, choosing every color and decoration to create a space that felt unquestionably hers. After years of sleeping in spaces that belonged to others, foster homes, trafficking facilities, cardboard boxes behind dumpsters, Emily needed a room that reflected her own preferences and personality. She'd chosen purple walls with silver stars, a bed with a canopy that provided the feeling of security without concealment, and shelves filled with books about brave girls who saved themselves and others. That evening, as Rebecca tucked Emily into bed beneath blankets she'd chosen herself, Emily looked up with the serious expression she wore when processing important thoughts. "Rebecca, do you think Mama knows that I'm okay now?" It was a question Emily asked periodically, usually when she was feeling particularly safe and happy, and wanted to share that feeling with the mother she'd lost too early. Rebecca had learned to answer with honesty rather than platitudes, understanding that Emily needed authentic responses to her spiritual questions. "I think she knows," Rebecca said gently, smoothing Emily's hair back from her face. "I think she can see how strong and smart and kind you've become, and I think she's proud of the way you've healed from things that would have broken people twice your age." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I think she knows you kept your promise too. Even when it was really hard and took a really long time." Rebecca felt tears threaten, but they were happy tears now, rather than the desperate grief that had once characterized her thoughts about Allison. "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope she knows that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." The following morning brought news that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of Emily's captivity. Rebecca received a call from the mayor's office, informing her that she and Emily had been selected to receive the city's highest civilian honor for their courage in exposing trafficking networks and advocating for system reforms that had protected countless other children. The ceremony took place in City Hall, where Emily stood beside Rebecca, wearing a blue dress she'd chosen specifically for the occasion, not because anyone had told her what to wear, but because she wanted to look nice for what she understood was an important event. The mayor spoke about courage that transformed tragedy into triumph, about citizens who risked everything to protect the most vulnerable members of society, and about the kind of love that changed laws and saved lives. "Rebecca Monroe gave up a fortune to save one child," the mayor said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of that sacrifice. "But in saving Emily Carter, she actually saved hundreds of children who will be protected by the reforms her courage made possible." When it came time for Rebecca to speak, she looked out at an audience that included trafficking survivors, law enforcement officers, social workers, and advocates who'd spent years fighting systems that prioritized procedure over protection. But her words were directed to Emily, who sat in the front row wearing the smile that had become Rebecca's greatest achievement. 2 years ago, a little girl taught me that love isn't something you feel, it's something you do. Emily showed me that keeping promises sometimes requires breaking rules, that protecting children sometimes requires adults to risk everything they think they value, and that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about showing up every day for the people who need you to be their safe place in a world that hasn't always been safe. After the ceremony, as they walked through the park where Emily liked to feed ducks and practice riding the bicycle Rebecca had taught her to use, Emily slipped her hand into Rebecca's with the casual affection of someone who no longer questioned whether tomorrow would bring safety or abandonment. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Emily asked, the question carrying the complexity of someone who understood that Rebecca had given up wealth and prestige for the privilege of being her mother. Rebecca looked at Emily, this miraculous child who'd survived horrors that would have destroyed adults, who'd learned to trust again despite every reason to remain guarded, who faced each day with courage that humbled everyone who knew her story, and realized that the question answered itself. "I miss nothing," Rebecca said simply. "This is the life I was meant to live." 6 months later, at a charity dinner hosted in their honor, the waiter who'd once tried to push Emily away approached their table with tears in his eyes. He'd followed their story through the media coverage of the trafficking trials, and he'd learned that the desperate child he'd dismissed as a nuisance had been fighting for her life in ways he'd never imagined. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, addressing Emily directly. "I should have seen that you needed help instead of trying to make you disappear." Emily looked up at him with the wisdom of someone who'd learned that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself rather than something others earned. "You see me now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Rebecca watched this exchange with pride that felt almost too large for her chest. Emily had learned to extend grace to people who'd failed her, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to let their failures define her capacity for hope. Sometimes the most broken children become the strongest lights, if only someone is brave enough to sit beside them in the darkness and hold their hand until dawn comes. Have you ever lived through something like this? Or do you know someone who has faced such overwhelming challenges? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us spread these important messages to more people who need to hear them. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.